Today we will explore one of the most intriguing and revealing episodes in medieval history. The moment when the very Pope of Rome turned the weight of his spiritual authority against a creature of the animal kingdom, triggering a persecution whose consequences would echo for generations, and perhaps have contributed to one of the greatest catastrophes in European history. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. It was the 13th century, and Europe breathed under a sky crossed by bells and prayers. The entire world was explained by theology, organized by ecclesiastical hierarchy, and governed by an absolute certainty that God had created the universe with an immutable purpose, and that it was up to the Church of Rome to interpret, guard, and defend that purpose in every generation. There was no clear separation between the sacred and the profane, between nature and the supernatural, between what was human law and what was divine law. Every phenomenon of the natural world could be read as a message from God or as a trap set by the devil. The storm that destroyed the harvest, the epidemic that reaped children, the plague of insects that devastated the fields, everything had a spiritual cause, and everything required a spiritual response. In this universe, Rome was not just a city among others. It was the heart of an entire continent, the radiating center of an authority that knew no geographical boundaries or social distinctions. From the peasant who plowed the earth with calloused hands to the king who sat on thrones of ornamented stone, all human beings who lived under the sky of Christendom recognized, to some degree, the authority that emanated from the basilicas and pontifical palaces. And the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, was the pinnacle of this edifice of power. He was the heir to the keys of Peter, the only man whose word could bind or loose souls for eternity. This power was not just symbolic, it was also political, legal, and economic. The papacy interfered in wars, settled disputes between kings, and legitimized or delegitimized entire dynasties. And the most feared instrument of this power was excommunication, the solemn act of expelling someone from the church community, depriving them of the sacraments, denying them Christian burial, and, in the belief that the centuries had consolidated, condemning them to an existence on the margins of divine grace. Kings trembled before this sentence. Emperors had humiliated themselves at castle doors to have it revoked. It was, in that time and in that world, the most powerful weapon that existed. But what happens when this weapon is raised not against a heretic, not against a rebellious king, not against a disobedient bishop, but against an animal? To answer this question, one must dive into the depths of a period that still fascinates, intrigues, and at times disturbs us. The European Middle Ages, a period that lasted approximately 1,000 years, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries. 1,000 years during which humanity built Gothic cathedrals that still haunt with their size and beauty, developed scholastic philosophy as one of the most rigorous intellectual traditions ever produced, created legal systems of great complexity, and at the same time waged crusades, persecuted heretics, and, in cases that history has recorded with meticulous attention, brought animals to trial before formal courts, not as an allegory, not as a farce, as a real legal and ecclesiastical practice documented and recorded in Acts and Chronicles that have survived to this day. The story this documentary tells begins with a specific character, at a specific moment: Pope Gregory IX, one of the most powerful and determined pontiffs of the 13th century. And it unfolds from a document he signed in the year 1233, a text that combined accounts of horror, systematic theology, and papal authority in a way that would seal the fate of a creature and possibly of thousands of human beings for generations. Ugolino di Conti was born around the year 1145 in the small town of Anagni, in the Latium region south of Rome. Anagni had a tradition of producing popes and would eventually become known as the City of the Popes. Ugolino grew up immersed in the ambitions and rituals of the ecclesiastical aristocracy, and his uncle was none other than Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and influential pontiffs in all of medieval history, the man who had elevated papal authority to an unprecedented level. Growing up under that shadow meant absorbing early on a very specific vision of what the papacy was and how its power should be used. Ugolino studied in Paris, the greatest intellectual center in Europe at the time, where scholasticism flourished under the masters of the cathedral schools, and in Bologna, where canon law was being systematized with an ambition and rigor that transformed the Church's legal tradition. Upon returning to Rome as a man formed in these traditions, he began an ascent that would be slow but inexorable. He became a cardinal, then a papal legate in different regions of Europe, representing Rome's interests in delicate negotiations with kings, emperors, and bishops. In each of these roles, Ugolino demonstrated the qualities that would define him: unwavering determination, political skill, profound religious conviction, and a willingness to use power when necessary without hesitation. In 1227, by then over 80 years old, he was elected pope. He assumed the name Gregory IX and took possession of the chair of St. Peter with the energy and determination of a much younger man. His longevity was, to many, a sign of divine providence in itself, as if God were preserving that specific man for tasks that still needed to be accomplished. And there was, in fact, much to do. The Europe of the early 13th century was a continent in turmoil. The Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the brilliant and enigmatic Frederick II, represented a permanent counterpower to papal ambitions. Heretical movements were flourishing everywhere, challenging the Church's authority with a variety of alternative doctrines. The Cathars, who preached a radical dualism between good and evil and rejected the Church's sacraments, had taken deep root in the south of France. The Waldensians, who valued apostolic poverty and questioned clerical authority, were spreading through regions of modern-day Italy and Switzerland. And in other territories, lesser-known but equally worrying groups for Rome were developing their own dissident theologies. Gregory IX played on all these fronts simultaneously. In 1227, he excommunicated Frederick II for having delayed a promised crusade, a political boldness that revealed his willingness for direct conflict with the most powerful secular power of the era. In 1231, he took the step that would define his most lasting legacy. He formalized the Papal Inquisition, creating an organized and permanent system to investigate, judge, and condemn heresies. Before Gregory IX, the persecution of heretics was an irregular process, often violent and uncoordinated, conducted by local bishops with varying degrees of rigor and fairness. With the Papal Inquisition, the persecution gained institutional structure. Professional inquisitors, trained in canon law, would travel through defined territories, following standardized procedures to investigate reports of heresy, conduct trials, and apply sentences. It was a system that, in the following generations, would become one of the most powerful and feared instruments of social control that the medieval world had known. 2 years after the formalization of the Inquisition, in 1233, a set of reports arrived in Rome that demanded an immediate response. The reports came from inquisitors and bishops in the Rhineland region, in the territory we now call Germany, and described something that deeply disturbed the Pope: the existence of heretical sects that practiced rituals of devil worship with an elaboration that seemed to signal the presence of Satan himself in the heart of Christendom. The texts that reached Rome were detailed, vivid, and disturbing. They described initiation ceremonies during which new members of the sects were forced to undergo trials that inverted and profaned Christian rituals. They described dark banquets, the worship of diabolical figures, and acts that ecclesiastical sensibilities immediately classified as the work of the evil one. The sect in question became known, in the sources of the time, as Luciferana, for its members supposedly believed that Lucifer had been unjustly expelled from heaven and that one day he would return to power. And at the center of many of these descriptions, recurrent and ever-present, appeared a figure that captured the Pope's full attention: a cat. More specifically, a cat of outsized proportions, sometimes described as large as a dog or even bigger, with dark fur which appeared during the heretics' rituals. The initiates would bow before this creature, worship it, and perform gestures of submission and reverence before it that the reports identified as diabolical cultism. In these narratives, the black cat was the visible manifestation of the demon, Satan choosing the form of a domestic animal to sneakily infiltrate the homes, lives, and souls of Christians. To the medieval man, these stories did not belong to the realm of fantasy or naive superstition. They were perfectly coherent with a mental universe in which the devil was a real, active being, constantly present in the world, endowed with powers that included the ability to assume different forms and to use creatures and objects as instruments of his plans. Medieval theological thought, from St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas, had constructed an elaborate demonology that defined the powers, methods, and goals of God's enemy. In this system, the idea that the devil could appear in the form of a cat was far from absurd. It had roots in biblical texts, theological treatises, and traditions that had been accumulating for centuries. The association between cats and evil was in fact not an invention of Gregory IX. It had roots that went back much further than the 13th century. In some pagan traditions of Northern Europe, felines were associated with deities and supernatural powers. With the expansion of Christianity across the continent, these powers were resignified. What had been sacred in previous religions was reinterpreted as a manifestation of the devil by Christian discourse. Gradually, throughout the centuries of the Christianization of Europe, the figure of the cat, especially that of a black-furred cat, became laden with dark connotations in the popular imagination. What Gregory IX did in 1233 was to take this diffuse prejudice, rooted in centuries of popular culture and reinforced by the reports arriving from inquisitors, and elevate it to the level of official ecclesiastical policy. By signing the document that would become known by its Latin opening as Vox in Rama, a voice in Rama, he placed the full weight of papal authority behind the identification of the black cat as an instrument of the devil and an unequivocal sign of heresy. The name of the document came from a passage in the book of Jeremiah, in the Old Testament. The expression evoked Rachel's weeping for her lost children, a biblical metaphor for lament and tragedy. In the context of the papal bull, it signaled that the Pope was hearing the cry of a church that saw its children being lost to heresy and evil, and that the moment had arrived to act with all available authority. The document was addressed to King Henry VII of Germany and the Archbishop of Mainz, and its stated purpose was to mobilize the secular and ecclesiastical powers of the Holy Roman Empire to eradicate the heresy that was rampant in the Rhineland. The text of the Vox in Rama described with disturbing detail the rituals that the heretics supposedly practiced. According to the document, when someone was initiated into this sect, they had to kiss a toad or a duck as part of the entrance ceremonies. During the sect's banquets, a cat of extraordinary size with black fur would appear, walking backward with its tail raised. Those present would bow before the animal, kiss it, and worship it as if it were a divinity. The document further stated that in the rituals of this sect, the lights were extinguished and acts were performed that the Church classified as crimes against Christian morality and natural law. It was, in short, a catalogue of horrors designed to justify the most severe intervention possible by ecclesiastical and secular authorities. And at the heart of this entire catalogue, the black cat appeared as a central symbol, as the point of convergence between human evil and the diabolical power that animated it. The man whom Gregory IX had chosen to lead the investigations in Germany was Conrad of Marburg, a figure whom history has recorded with a mixture of fascination and horror. Conrad was a preacher and inquisitor who had distinguished himself by his ferocity and moral absolutism. He was a man who saw the world in terms of black and white, of virtue and sin, of God and the devil. Any nuance, any ambiguity, any space for doubt were, for him, signs of spiritual weakness or complicity with evil. Conrad had preached the crusade, had conducted heresy investigations with a rigor that many of his contemporaries considered excessive, and had built a reputation that inspired as much respect as it did terror. Under his direction, the investigations in the Rhineland turned into a mechanism of persecution that fed upon itself. The accused were summoned, interrogated, and often convicted based on confessions produced under intense pressure. The inquisitorial system of the time did not require material evidence in the sense that modern law demands. Confession was considered the queen of proofs, and the inquisitors had effective means at their disposal to obtain it. Neighbors denounced neighbors. The mere possession of a dark-furred cat at home could be enough to attract the unwanted attention of the investigators. The terror that Conrad sowed was so intense that it eventually triggered a backlash. In July 1233, the same year that Vox in Rama was issued, the Inquisitor was murdered while on a journey. His attackers were local nobles who had been accused of heresy and who decided to eliminate the man who threatened them. His death was violent and swift, an end that his admirers mourned as martyrdom and that his enemies hailed as justice. But the death of Conrado did not end the movement he had helped to trigger. The machinery of the Inquisition that Gregory IX had created was institutional, and it would continue to operate regardless of who stood at its head. And the association between the Black Cat and the devil, reinforced by the authority of the Vox in Rama, was now etched into the European imagination in a way that would outlive generations of popes and inquisitors. In the years and decades that followed the document of 1233, cats, especially those with dark fur, were progressively transformed into objects of suspicion, fear, and systematic persecution. Historians document cases of towns where cats were burned in public squares during religious festivals, especially during the feasts of St. John the Baptist, when the boundary between the world of the living and the supernatural world was considered most permeable. In some regions of northern Europe, there were traditions of throwing cats from towers as part of rituals that combined pagan and Christian elements. In other regions, the animals were collected and burned in collective bonfires as acts of ritual purification of the community. The feline populations of European cities and villages were progressively reduced by a combination of active persecution, abandonment, and ritual elimination. It is impossible to quantify with precision the extent of this decline, as there are no animal censuses from the medieval period. But historians of historical ecology agree that the relationship between the persecution of felines and the proliferation of rats deserves serious attention. And here, history takes a turn that belongs as much to medicine as it does to theology, a turn whose consequences would be felt throughout Europe in the 14th century. But before we reach that dark chapter, it is necessary to explore another aspect of this history that is equally fascinating and equally revealing of the medieval mental universe, the extraordinary phenomenon of animal trials. For the Vox in Rama and the persecution of cats were part of a much broader picture. In medieval Europe, animals of all kinds were regularly subjected to formal trials, not as a metaphor, not as theatrical staging, but as real legal proceedings, with lawyers, witnesses, deliberations, and sentences. This practice, which seems disconcerting to us today, was considered completely normal and legally legitimate in the context of medieval law. To understand how this was possible, one must understand the philosophical and theological system that underpinned the medieval worldview. At the center of this system was the concept that the scholastics called the Great Chain of Being, a cosmic hierarchy that organized all of creation in a sequence that went from God at the top through angels, human beings, animals, plants, and minerals. Each element of this chain had a place, a function, and a dignity of its own, determined by God at the moment of creation. Animals, situated below human beings in this hierarchy, owed obedience and subjection to human authority. When an animal transgressed this order, it was not just causing material damage, it was subverting the divine order that God had established. And when the divine order was subverted, it had to be restored. This was the role of the law, both civil and ecclesiastical. Animal trials in the Middle Ages were divided into two main types. The first was the secular trial, conducted by civil courts, usually involving domestic animals accused of crimes against people. The second was the ecclesiastical trial, conducted by the Church, usually involving plagues of wild animals or insects accused of destroying crops and causing collective suffering to communities. Within the realm of secular trials, the most frequent subjects were pigs. In medieval Europe, these animals lived in unusual proximity to human beings. They wandered the streets of villages and cities, often unleashed, searching for food wherever they could find it. This proximity created real risks. Pigs are animals of considerable size, with powerful jaws, and attacks on small children were a tragic occurrence in the villages of the period. When this happened, the response of the medieval legal system was not just the elimination of the animal. It was a formal trial, with all the formalities that the law required for any defendant. One of the cases most documented and most cited by historians is that which occurred in Falaise in Normandy, in the autumn of 1386. A sow had attacked and killed a baby, a crime that medieval law classified as homicide, regardless of the fact that the perpetrator was an animal. The animal was arrested and taken to the local authorities. It was formally charged, subjected to trial, and sentenced to death. What distinguishes the case of Falaise, however, is not just the sentence. It is the ritual that accompanied it. The sow was dressed in human clothing. They put a garment on her, as if she were a human criminal. And so dressed, she was taken to the public square and executed by hanging, just as a criminal convicted of homicide would be executed. This ritual was not arbitrary cruelty. It was a deeply significant symbolic act within the medieval system of values. The animal that had transgressed the boundary between the animal world and the human world would be punished under the terms of the human world. The community needed to see justice done in a visible and ritualized way so that the disturbed order could be restored. In 1457, in the locality of Savigny, a sow was sentenced to death for having killed a 5-year-old boy. The sow's piglets, which had been found with traces of blood on their snouts, were initially indicted along with their mother, but the court ended up acquitting them, accepting the argument that they were too young to have acted with deliberation and that they had been influenced by the bad example of their mother. This detail reveals something deeply significant. The court was not just staging a comedy of manners. It was applying real legal principles, such as the mitigation of responsibility due to age and context, to defendants who were, in practice, animals. The system took itself absolutely seriously. And the animals had lawyers. In many of these trials, especially ecclesiastical ones, a defense attorney was formally appointed to represent the interests of the animal defendants before the court. The lawyer for a pig or a swarm of locusts was not a folkloric curiosity. He was a legal officer who performed his function with professional seriousness, arguing in defense of his clients, citing texts of canon law, and invoking precedents. The most famous case of an animal lawyer is that of Barthélemy de Chassaneuz, a young jurist from Burgundy, who in the year 1522 was called to represent the rats of the Autumn region. The rats had devastated the barley crops of the region with an efficiency that left the local communities in severe food shortages. The ecclesiastical authorities decided to summon the rats to appear before the court to answer for their actions. Barthélemy de Chassaneuz was appointed to defend them. This young man, decades later, would become one of the most respected French jurists of his time, president of the Parliament of Provence and author of legal treatises studied for generations. But at that moment, he was a young lawyer facing a seemingly impossible task, defending defendants who had no way of appearing anywhere. When the rats failed to appear on the appointed date, the court asked the lawyer to explain the absence of his clients. Chassaneuz replied with an argument that demonstrated not only creativity, but also a solid background in procedural law. The summons had been irregular. To be valid, he argued, it would have needed to be read in all the churches of the region so that all the rats could have been aware of their obligation to appear. The court considered the argument and ordered the summons to be repeated more comprehensively. On the second appointed date, the rats again failed to show up. Chassaneuz returned to court with a second argument. His clients were entitled to sufficient time to prepare for the journey, and the route was dangerous because the rats ran the risk of being attacked by cats along the way. Before appearing, they needed a guarantee of safe conduct. The court discussed this argument seriously and granted a new extension. The case dragged on without a formal conviction being issued, which was likely exactly what Chassaneuz had planned from the start, to create procedural conditions that would prevent the conclusion of the trial. What the case of the Rats of Autumn reveals is the seriousness with which the medieval legal system treated these proceedings, to the point that a court spent months deliberating on the procedural rights of rodents. Chassaneuz became famous for this unlikely defense, and the arguments he developed in that trial were later published in a legal treatise that circulated widely among 16th-century European scholars. The young defender of the rats transformed his legal adventure into a doctrinal document that contributed to the development of European procedural law. Insects, for their part, were the most frequent defendants in ecclesiastical courts. Throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, Plagues of caterpillars, locusts, weevils, slugs, and a variety of other insects were regularly subjected to proceedings of excommunication and condemnation by ecclesiastical authorities across Europe. In 1476, in the city of Bern, Switzerland, a plague of slugs and caterpillars that was destroying the fields of the region was formally excommunicated by the local bishop after an ecclesiastical procedure that included summons, deliberation, and sentencing. In Valence, in the south of France, a plague of weevils attacking the vineyards was brought to trial in 1587, in a process that lasted several months and ended with a sentence that, thanks to an ingenious argument from their defender, gave the insects an alternative territory where they could dwell without causing damage to human crops. The excommunication of animals may seem paradoxical, given that animals are not baptized members of the Christian community and therefore should not be subject to excommunication in the strict sense of the term. Medieval theologians and jurists were aware of this difficulty and developed arguments to resolve it. One of the most common was that the Church exercised authority over all of God's creation, not just baptized human beings. By excommunicating them, the Church formally withdrew its spiritual protection from the creatures in question and handed them over to the consequences of their transgressions. Another argument was more instrumental in nature. The excommunication was accompanied by prayers, processions, and collective acts of penance by the community, and the ecclesiastical trial of the animal functioned as a ritual of collective purification. The philosophical system that underpinned all these practices had deep roots in the Christian intellectual tradition. St. Augustine, in the 5th century, had developed a theology of creation that situated every living being within a divine plan. St. Thomas Aquinas, an exact contemporary of Gregorius Nauf in the 13th century, had elaborated a philosophical synthesis of great depth that articulated the Aristotelian tradition with Christian theology to create a worldview in which every element of nature had its place, its function, and its value within the divine order. For Thomas, animals were creatures that acted by instinct, not by moral deliberation. But this irrationality did not place them beyond the reach of the law, because the law was not merely a human convention, it was a reflection of natural law, which in turn was a reflection of the divine law that ordered the universe. Some medieval jurists argued that animals could be instruments of the devil, and that the punishment was directed not so much at the animal as at the malignant power that animated it. Others argued that the punishment had an exemplary function for the human community. The animal was punished not because it understood the penalty, but so that humans would see that no transgression of the divine order went unanswered. This second line of reasoning suggests that animal trials had as much to do with the human community as with the animal defendants themselves. They were rituals of reaffirmation of the moral order, public stagings of justice that functioned as mechanisms of social cohesion. When a community gathered to witness the trial of a pig or to hear the excommunication of a swarm of locusts, it was participating in a collective ritual that reaffirmed its values, its belief in the divine order, and its trust in the institutions that represented it. Let us now return to the thread that links all these stories to their darkest point: the persecution of cats and the document that Pope Gregorius the Mime signed in 1233, and the consequences that accumulated over an entire century. After the death of Conrad von Marburg, the investigations into Luciferianism in Germany continued, but with less intensity. Gregorius IX himself faced other crises, and his permanently conflictual relationship with Emperor Friedrich II consumed a large part of his diplomatic energy. The Pope died in 1241, without having seen the resolution of many of the battles he had initiated, but the document he had signed continued to produce effects long after his death. The Vox in Rama was not a temporary law. It was a papal declaration that carried the authority of Rome, and which could be invoked, cited, and applied for centuries. The association between the black cat and the devil, reinforced by pontifical authority, became part of the European imaginary in a way that persisted well beyond the pontificate of Gregorius IX. Heretical groups such as the Cathars and the Waldensians were frequently accused of rituals involving cats, regardless of any concrete evidence. The accusation had become a template, a standard way of demonizing the enemy. And while this was happening in the chambers of the inquisitors and in ecclesiastical documents, in the streets and alleys of European cities, cats continued to be persecuted and eliminated. The feline populations of medieval cities suffered a reduction that historians evaluate with caution, but which was real. And with fewer cats, the rats thrived. With more rats, the fleas that lived on them thrived as well. And it was precisely in this environment that, in the summer of 1347, the Black Death arrived. Genoese ships anchor in the ports of Sicily, bringing a cargo that was not on any manifest. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the Black Death, had traveled through Central Asia and the Middle East with devastating voracity, and was now spreading across the European continent with a speed and brutality that paralyzed populations. The disease manifested in different forms: the bubonic form, the pneumonic form, the septicemic form. The bubo that swelled in the armpits and groins, the coughing of blood, the accelerated decomposition, and the pace at which it arrived. Cities that were in full swing 1 week were covered in the dead 2 weeks later. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of the European population succumbed to the Black Death in its first outbreak, between 1347 and 1352. In some regions, mortality was even higher. Entire villages were completely abandoned. The social, economic, and religious structures of Europe were profoundly shaken in an extraordinarily short period of time. Yersinia pestis spread primarily through the fleas of the black rat, Rattus rattus, an animal that had thrived in medieval European cities with their granaries full of grain and their narrow streets. The infected fleas left the rat when it died and sought new hosts, including humans living in close proximity to the rodents. And here, history returns to the black cat and the vox in Rama, in a way that contemporary historians analyze with caution but with increasing seriousness. The question researchers pose is this: is there a causal relationship between the persecution of cats that followed the document of Pope Gregory IX and the devastation caused by the Black Death? The honest answer is possibly, at least in part, and with many caveats. The relationship between the presence of cats and the control of rat populations is well established by biology and ecology. If cat populations in European cities were systematically reduced over more than a century of persecution, then rat populations would have grown without this natural control. But the Black Death was an extraordinarily multifactorial phenomenon. Climatic factors, demographic factors, the virulence of the specific strain of Yersinia pestis that reached Europe at that moment. All these elements contributed to the catastrophe. Attributing the devastation of the Black Death exclusively to the persecution of cats would be a simplification that historical evidence does not support. What historical evidence does support is a more modest yet still disturbing assertion that the systematic persecution of cats, legitimized by papal authority and sustained by decades of a culture of fear, deprived European cities of a natural controller of rat populations at a time when that control could have made a difference. And this deprivation may have contributed to some degree to the conditions that allowed the Black Death to spread with the devastation that history recorded. The irony is almost unbearable. Pope Gregory IX had persecuted the cat as an instrument of the devil, but in doing so, he may have contributed to creating the conditions that allowed death to arrive in Europe on a scale that seemed, to the survivors, literally apocalyptic. This dimension of history forces us to reflect on a question that transcends the medieval period. How is it that power, exercised with conviction and with the best of intentions, can produce consequences that no one desired and no one anticipated? Gregory IX was not a cruel man in the sense that the word has for us today. He was a man deeply formed by the intellectual tradition of his time, convinced that he was serving God and protecting humanity against what he perceived as an existential threat. When he signed the Vox in Rama, he was acting within the parameters that his value system defined as correct and urgent, but the effects of his actions completely escaped those parameters, because the world is more complex than any value system can capture in its totality. Because nature obeys its own laws, regardless of the laws that humans create to interpret it. Animal trials continued in Europe for centuries after the pontificate of Gregory IX. The last documented trial of an animal in Europe dates to 1906, when a dog was tried for complicity in murder in Switzerland. More than 5 centuries separate that trial from the case of Falaise in 1386. 5 centuries during which the practice was slowly becoming increasingly rare, increasingly marginal, until it disappeared completely from the legal horizon. With the advent of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and later the Enlightenment, the worldview that sustained these practices began to fragment. Natural philosophy, the predecessor of what we today call science, began to offer alternative explanations for phenomena that were previously interpreted in purely theological terms. A plague of insects came to be understood as a biological phenomenon subject to the laws of nature, rather than the work of the devil. The idea that a court could try a grasshopper progressively lost its coherence within the dominant intellectual system. The change was not abrupt. For centuries, emerging scientific thought and traditional theological thought coexisted in tension, each claiming for itself the interpretation of natural phenomena. There were jurists who, as early as the 16th century, expressed doubts about the legal legitimacy of animal trials, questioning whether it was possible to hold creatures devoid of reason and free will morally responsible. And there were theologians who, at the same time, defended the continuation of the practices with arguments that mixed tradition, patristic authority, and scholastic reasoning. This tension between the old certainty and the new doubt is in itself one of the most fascinating stories of the transition period between the Middle Ages and modernity. The fear of the black cat, however, survived the fall of the theological system that had created it. Transformed into popular superstition, emptied of its original theological content, it persisted in European and American cultures long after the Middle Ages. In many Western societies, the idea that a black cat crossing one's path brings bad luck is still widely known, a remote and faded echo of the Vox in Rama and the campaign of Gregory IX that, centuries later, continues to exist as a fragment of cultural memory, without any longer remembering its origins. From a historical and legal point of view, animal trials are today studied as privileged windows into the mental and social universe of the Middle Ages. They reveal how medieval society understood the relationship between humans and nature, between law and divine order, between institutional power and the daily reality of communities. They are documents of an era in which the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, between the legal and the theological, were much more permeable than in modernity. The men and women who watched the trial of a pig in Falaise, who listened to the excommunication of weevils in the vineyards, who committed black cats to the fire in the squares of European cities, were not necessarily cruel people or devoid of intelligence. They were people formed within a belief system that explained the world in a specific way, and who acted according to those beliefs with the same conviction with which we act according to our own. The difference is that we have the privilege of looking back and recognizing where they went wrong, which does not guarantee, of course, that future generations will not look back at our time with the same reflexive discomfort. This perhaps is the most enduring lesson we can draw from the story of Gregorio IX, of Vox in Rama, and of the animal trials of the Middle Ages. It is not a lesson about medieval irrationality or religious superstition as a phenomenon exclusive to a past time. It is a lesson about human nature, about the relationship between power and knowledge, between faith and consequence, between the intention to do good and the risk of causing harm. It is a lesson about how certainty, when not tempered by humility and openness to doubt, can become the instrument of damage that no one planned. The Pope who signed the document condemning the Black Cat died in 1241, more than a century before the Black Death reached Europe. He never saw the wider consequences of what he had set in motion. The inquisitors who traveled through the Rhineland in the name of faith, the courts that dressed sows in human clothing before hanging them, the bishops who excommunicated plagues of insects with the solemnity of an ecclesiastical ritual, all acted within a system that seemed to them completely coherent, completely justified, completely necessary. And that perhaps is what makes this story so enduringly disturbing. Not the absurdity of the animal trials themselves, but the seriousness with which they were conducted, the meticulousness of the records, the sophistication of the legal arguments, the sincerity of the faith that motivated them. Because if these men, with all their intelligence and all their conviction, could err so profoundly in judgments that cost lives, then the question that remains, silent and inescapable, is, where are we erring now with equal sincerity and equal conviction? That is the question that history, in its severe generosity, leaves us without an answer. And it is exactly why continuing to tell it matters. If the journey through this fascinating and somber chapter of human history has awakened in you the curiosity that drives us to build these narratives, then the next story is already waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe now so that each new trip to the past reaches you directly without you having to look for it. Leave in the comments what impacted you most in this narrative. Was it the papal condemnation of an animal? The unexpected sophistication of medieval courts? The lawyer for the rats? Or the tragic irony between the persecution of cats and the arrival of the Black Death? Like this video to help others find these stories. And if someone around you would be fascinated by this universe, share it with them. Because history, as we learned today, has its own persistent way of spreading. And when it is good, we must let it.